Thousands of people gathered today for Alexei Navalny's funeral in Moscow. Mourners chanted as the Russian opposition leader's body was carried from the church to a nearby cemetery. Police had the area surrounded after the Kremlin warned against any unauthorized gatherings today. Navalny died 2 weeks ago while detained in an Arctic penal colony. The cause of his death is still unknown, but many Western leaders blame Russian President Vladimir Putin. Bill Browder is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. He's also CEO of Hermitage Capital, and he joins me now from New York City. Bill Browder, it's good to speak with you today. Thank you, sir.
Good to be here.
We saw fairly significant crowds today at Navalny's funeral, and you wrote on X that the killing of Navalny will haunt Putin until the end of his days. What do you think the consequences of this will be?
Well, Alexei Navalny has become a martyr for freedom, for democracy, and for a normal Russia. This is what people had hoped for, and Putin was scared of that. But Navalny's his image, his symbolism is just as strong in death as it was in life.
Your lawyer and friend, Sergei Magnitsky, was imprisoned and died in 2009, and you called for the creation of Magnitsky Acts, which have led to sanctioning and travel bans around the world. You're now calling for a Navalny Act. What are you looking for there?
Well, we're looking for something that will seriously hurt Vladimir Putin for committing this murder. And what could seriously hurt Vladimir Putin at this point is that there's $300 billion of Russian government central bank reserves that were frozen 1 week into the war. And what would really hurt Putin is if the West, the EU, the UK, US, Canada, Australia, and others confiscated that money, took that money away from Vladimir Putin, gave it to Ukraine for their defense and reconstruction, and said to Vladimir Putin, this is the Navalny Act. For killing Alexei Navalny, it just cost you $300 billion.
We've heard this discussed publicly. I've had conversations with this about Canadian officials who support the idea intellectually, though the amount of Russian assets available to be seized in Canada is quite low. But there is a pushback against it and a disagreement amongst the G7 and Western leaders because of the precedent it would set, that other nations might start seizing other countries' assets and the knock-on effect of that. What do you say to leaders who are reluctant to do this for those specific reasons?
Well, the precedent that's being set is that if a country does a terrible invasion, unwarranted, aggressive invasion, killing the civilians and destroying the infrastructure of a neighboring country, then that country's assets will be confiscated. That's a good precedent. That's not a bad precedent. That's a precedent that China should pay attention to and countries in the Middle East should pay attention to. And the fear that somehow that it's not going to be safe to put your money in the US or the EU or the UK is ill-founded, because what's going to happen is all of these countries together are going to do this. And people who have money have nowhere else to put it. You can't keep your money in Iranian rials or Argentine pesos because those are basically Mickey Mouse currencies. The major reserve currencies of the world are the dollar, the euro, the Canadian dollar, the pound. And if all countries in these civilized countries were to do this, then you end up in a situation where people have to keep their money and continue to keep their money in these countries.
It's easy to see how $300 billion would help Ukraine. How would seizing assets that are already frozen and unavailable to Russia affect Russia? Is it simply by moving it to the other side of the ledger and giving it to President Zelensky and his country for their defense and reconstruction?
Well, what I can tell you about Vladimir Putin is that he is a man who doesn't value human life at all. He's ready to send in hundreds of thousands of soldiers to their deaths without even blinking an eye. But he's a guy who values money infinitely. And so for us to confiscate that money is really two fingers in the eye for Vladimir Putin.
I wonder, sir, your thoughts on where the death of Mr. Navalny leaves the opposition movement in Russia right now. Vladimir Kara-Murza, he's one of the opposition leaders sentenced to 25 years. He's refusing to give up, urging opposition supporters to continue the fight of what him and people like Mr. Navalny were working for. What do you think might happen to Mr. Kara-Murza? Do you think there is a figure to fill that space left by Mr. Navalny's death?
Well, Vladimir Kara-Murza is the most important political prisoner in Russia. We know that from a variety of different standpoints, but the most importantly is that they've given him the longest sentence of any political prisoner in Russia. They've sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a man who has really been very articulate and vocal and charismatic about his call for freedom, for democracy, for free speech, and for normal relations with the rest of the world. And so we need him to stay alive. We can't afford another murder. And so now that we've lost Alexei Navalny, who is the voice for all those things, we have to do everything possible in the West to protect and save the life of Vladimir Kara-Murza. And he's a Canadian, honorary Canadian citizen. And I hope that the Canadian government will use whatever power they have to work with allies to free Vladimir Kara-Murza so he doesn't die as well.
This is the challenge, though, of dealing with a country like Russia under a leader like Putin right now, is people get sent to jail for political reasons, and they often don't make it out, and they don't make it out alive. And I just wonder, we saw more than 100 people and counting arrested today for showing up to mourn the death of Mr. Navalny. What do you think this says about where Mr. Putin is, where Vladimir Putin is, in cracking down on dissent inside his country at this stage of the war?
Well, at this stage, Putin has kind of given up on winning the hearts and minds of the Russians. It's no longer a possibility for him with all these dead soldiers, with the economy in a total state of disarray, with the repressions that are taking place every day in Russia. And so all he can do now is crack down to become a total totalitarian dictator. And that's what he's doing. And that's, the people didn't show up to have riots for Alexei Navalny. They showed up to mourn Alexei Navalny, and 100 of them were arrested. 400 were arrested on the day after he was killed, laying flowers. Putin is showing himself to be absolutely terrified of his own people. And this is not a sign of strength. This is a sign of immense weakness. And it shows that any significant crack in the regime, any significant public uprising could spin out of control for him, which is why he's so scared.
You mentioned the state of the economy as one of his challenges. In the wake of Mr. Navalny's death, we saw the U.S., the U.K., the EU, and others impose new sanctions on Russia, targeting its war machine. Do you see those having an impact at this stage? It seems to me if these sanctions were truly powerful, they would have been imposed a long time ago. I mean, what is the value of these at these stages? Will they make a difference?
Well, the sanctions are making a big difference. So we've just talked about the central bank reserves, which are frozen, and that's $300 billion. Where there's a huge amount of oligarch money that's frozen, hundreds and hundreds of billion. The Russian companies and Russian government has no longer access to borrow money on the international capital markets, which is very significant. There's huge bans on imports. The Russian people can't travel outside of Russia unless they go to Dubai or other places like that. Planes are literally doing emergency landings because they've run out of spare parts. And so things are not going well for the Russians. And to say the sanctions aren't working is not correct. Well, to say that sanctions haven't stopped the war is correct. So what do we do to completely obliterate Putin's ability to conduct this war? Well, there's one final elephant in the room, which is that Russia continues to sell oil to the international oil markets and gets hundreds of billions of dollars a year from doing so, and then spends those hundreds of billions of dollars a year on their war economy, buying missiles and ammunition from North Korea and drones from Iran, and paying for factories to make more tanks in Russia. And so if we want to finish this off, stop the war, we need to figure out a way so Putin doesn't get that money. And that's a tough one, because Russia is such an important oil supplier. They supply 10% of the world's oil. To stop them supplying that oil would push up the price of oil. We're in a world of inflation and cost of living problems. And so that's the big quandary, is how do you stop Russia from getting that money? And perhaps the answer is we get all of our allies and ourselves, the US and Canada, to produce more oil, get the Saudis to produce more oil, and then cut Russia off completely and finally so they don't have the money to continue this war. But that's a hard decision, and that's been the one that hasn't been taken yet.
Bill Browder, I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us today, sir.
Thank you.